The second question for today's our discussion is actually ethical issues in genetic research. What are the easy and informing questioning about the ethical issues in the genetic research, that these are correlated with the values, with the certain values which are supposed to be implemented to the genetic research and engineering in general. Most genes are not 100% penetrant. Most phenotypes are not engaged by only one gene. That's we know from the theory, that's we know from the practice. Many genes are pleiotropic, influencing more than one characteristic which have been given to the health of the person. Most human characteristics results from a confluence of genetics and the environment. And such a co-influence of the genetics and environment getting the resulted as the bridge between the actual inside phenomenon which have been included to the person's health, which have been included as the natural phenomenon inside of the human being, and the environmental phenomena which have been started, which have been formulated for the social conditions. The getting such a co-influence between genetics and the environment have been implemented by the bioethics with the reasonably, because such a co-influence of the genetics and environment also getting the perception on the way how the people perceive itself. You remember that while we were talking about the social rules, the social involvement and the formation of the ethical values, we have mentioned this co-influence of the inside natural phenomenon and the social environment which have been formulated, which have been implemented to the understanding of bioethical vision and ethical vision of the values. The question of whether genetic information carries special potential for harm and is thus in need of special protection continues to be controversial, not just by the side of the bioethics, but predominantly by the side of the legal experts, because the legal experts in the field of the healthcare, in the field of the medical service, understand that the genetic research has and especially genetic engineering has a special potential for harm, not just for the personhood, but for the predicting of the further generation. We will see how it's influenced the genetic changing. We will see how it's influenced the changing of the usage of the genetic engineering in the further phenomenon. But for you right now is to understand that this potential for harm inside the genetics is quite big, it's quite influential. So that's why the bioethics get the coincide phenomenon for the special protection activity inside, not just the education, not just as the part of the educational phenomenon, but also as the part of the legal phenomenon. I can give you an example of Thomas Murray, which he pointed out firstly in the end of the 20th century, in 1999. He coined the term genetic exceptionalism to describe the belief that genetic information is sufficiently different from other types of health-related information, that it deserves special protection. It deserves special protection. The end of the quote. I want to underline to you about this term genetic exceptionalism that he had coined out. That's because the information itself needs to be protected, and partially and especially the information concerning the genetic nature of the human being, of the certain personhood. The special protection is supposed to be made just on the national level, nationwide level, because certain procedure, I know the examples, and you will have certain examples during the practical classes when the international communities of the nations, like the European community, also have certain agreement on the usage of and the protection of the health-related information get by the genetic testing. So these genetic exceptionalisms, which were mentioned, which were coined out by Thomas Murray, is widely used in the law and still will be the part of the discussion for the community in the future. From Murray's point of view, however, is that there are very few traits that are entirely genetic or entirely environmental. If we are getting the condition of, you remember, split of the genesis and the genetical questions and the question of the social environment. And that most of the factors associated with genetic information and genetic research have known genetic analogs that deserve the same level of protection, and that is why the legal part of the such a protection is supposed to precisely identify this information which is related with the particular genetic research and the phenomena which influence the genetic understanding of the personhood. The non-genetic analogs also can be shadowily influence the level of protection by the law, but it's also getting the misunderstanding and misorder. That's once more we're supposed to collect more and more data on the genetic research and the usage of the genetic engineering. That's getting the information is getting the new approaches in formation of the values and the formation of the legal base and the protection of the people from the misusage of the information getting from the genetic research. Research can range from a narrowly focused study of one unique family to worldwide studies involving thousands of subjects. Genome-wide association studies, the search of the genomes of the individuals with diseases compared with those without diseases, requires thousands of participants in order to arrive at statistically significant results, and that is why the transnational cooperation, as I have mentioned to you several minutes ago, still in the front of the formation. And the role of bioethics is to perform the common communication field for the for such a studies, for such a genetic research, to protect the right of the human being, to protect the right of the personhood, for the protection of the information. The personhood, which we can understand from the point of view of genetics, that's the number of gens, number of gen connection which actually form the health status of the personhood. Later on, it will transform to the protection of the healthcare protection of the certain group of people, of the certain ethnicity, or the globally taken genome-wide association studies. And you see the level of the influence of the genetic research, if we're talking about the ethical terms, is getting from the personhood, from the focusing of the unique family, on the involvement of the thousands of subjects of such a research. And it's different. It's getting the communication level, communication procedure supposed to be done properly, especially while we are using the information. If we are getting the worldwide studies, if we are getting the involvement of the thousands of subjects for the same type of the research, the same type of the field. For sure, there is the general information which will be publicly distributed, but also the information also supposed to be protected by the certain group of researchers which have done the wide association studies. And the status of the genome-wide association studies supposed to be strictly precise by the law, by the legal procedure on the national level and the level of international organization. And here the cooperation between the certain legal communities, between the bioethical schools, are also important in the sense that it requires long-term conditions for the protecting of the information. Because for some of the reasons at the law, the protection of the information concerning the genetics have been rated only with the person who have been alive. And what about information on the people who have been died? That means the information will further live after the death of the human being and furtherly can be used if we're talking about the genetic research. What about these stages? And of course this is the question not just for the once more legal system, because it's quite difficult to implement this results, right, of the research unless there is really signed by the person who got this information, from whom we got this information, to use it during after that period. That's from one hand, and from another hand, that's bioethical question of the usage. Do we have the personhood, or this information only exists as the scientific phenomenon? Do we have to understand this information as the part of the uniqueness of the information, the uniqueness of the personhood, or this is the general part of the social development, the general part of the social influence of that information towards the towards the people, further generations. These are the questions which are raised by these genome-wide association studies, and which these ethical issues are the part of the discussion. Because few health states are completely lacking in a genetic component, even a broken leg may reflect an inborn tendency to clumsiness or to risk-taking. Genetic research holds out great promise for understanding diseases and ameliorating human suffering from these diseases. For sure, maybe there's a declaration concerning that it's great promise for understanding diseases particularly, and for understanding the nature of the human being. It's also getting the risk that the science can become, and this particular genetic science, genetic engineering, can become sort of the religion to those who believe that the medical service is supposed to protect the human's health. And for sure, at the future, the question of the genetic research in protecting, in ameliorating of the human suffering will be raised and will be discussed, because once more we still don't have information, the data which prove the usage of the genetic research. Definitely we can come to the certain ideas about the long period of the usage of the genetics, and there you will see that people will suffer and will try to understand why this suffering happened. And while we are suffering, we'll get in all the information, all the parts of the information field. So this is why the genetic research and the promising part for the understanding diseases will play an important role. And that will raise also, as I have mentioned to you, the question of the education, how to use this information. And the question of education, will it be useful to use information for changing, or we will need just to know about and protect ourselves from the certain diseases and from certain conditions of increasing disease. One ethically complex field of study involves behavioral genetics, which seeks to explain human behavior through genetics and genetically environment interaction. That's interesting case. While the psychological phenomena, such as psychological phenomena as the behavior, will come for the understanding of the genetics, for the new science of the new type of the research. And genetic environmental interaction right now will see as the part of the communicational level, as the part of the introduction, as the part of the socializing of the personhood towards the social phenomenon, towards the social roles. Its claims of genetic components to intelligence, violence, sexual orientation, and so on carry complex societal implications towards the human being. And this genetic environmental interaction will face, with the help of the genetics, a new issue, the issue of the certain prejudgments on certain situation. That's because of the human behavior which have been influenced by a certain gene. And here the question of the genetic research, the question of the genetic engineering will come to the formation of new types of interaction, to new types of the communicational procedure, to the new types of the understanding of clear understanding the way how behavior at this communication have been formulated. And of course human behavior also will be the part of not just the psychological phenomenon, not just the psychological description, but also bioethical one, because the values of the behavior may be, according to this tradition, according to this prominent technology, will be due to change, not just because of the social values criteria, but also by the certain influence on the genders. Will it be good or not? That's the question for the prediction. But still, that will be the result of the serious research in the human behavior through the genetics. Genetic research can use tissue samples such as blood, saliva, and solid tissue, including samples originally obtained and stored for other issues and from source long deceased. And also samples shared with researchers pursuing different projects in different institutions with the different conditions and with the different goals of the research. There's also truly question of the bioethical methodology. How the results supposed to be shared and how these samples of the genetic research supposed to be shared, if it even has a common, if it even has a simply same maybe field of research. But the reason why the different institutions have the equal access to this information, equal access to the sample shared by the genetic research, it's also the question of the ethical usage of the research and ethical usage of the information which have been constructed by the genetic research. And here, ethical issues of the genetic research, such as privacy, come to the primary concern. Privacy and the question of the genetic research is primary concern for many commentators, and risks to privacy are taken seriously in the practice and regulation of research with human subjects. At least when those subjects are alive. You remember, we have such a condition of the subjects who are alive, who can influentially use the privacy of the information, and those people who are dead, and after the death of the person, this information can be used. Specimens and research results that cannot be connected to their sources are usually thought to pose little risk. And genetic research on stored tissue samples is unusual in that research use can persist certain conditions and certain research phenomenon for the inside insiders inside information concerning people who are dead right now at the moment of the usage of such information. And thus research on stored tissue has highlighted an old ethical debate on whether deceased persons can have interests and whether those interests can be harmed while we are using this information after the death of the person. It's not just the question of the law, it's actually the question of the philosophy, and particularly the question of the bioethical discussion. Another way of arguing for this same point is to say that those of us who are now alive and conscious want our own wishes to be honored once we are dead or permanently unaware, and therefore have an interest in protecting the interests of the dead and unaware. And such a protection also supposed to be systematically formed by the science, systematically formed by the jointly by the genetic engineering and the bioethics, and protected with the state system of the protection of the human rights. Laws of privacy are being publicly identified with the genetic trait associated with the stigma or discrimination is a major focus of a policy and regulation. The discrimination by the usage of the genetic information, and the discrimination by the usage of the information itself by making update of the research and by making the comparison of different research which have been done. Potential research subjects are regularly reassured that their privacy will be protected, and much energy goes into de-identifying information by the researchers and de-identifying them as the part of the research, and disconnected it with the privacy, disconnected with the private phenomenon. For sure, except the ethical issues of the privacy, we have confidentiality can also be threatened by publishing findings about an identifiable group, even though the identities of individuals are adequately protected. Genetic research often focuses on small, cohesive groups because genetic traits can be concentrated in groups of people who descend from a small number of common ancestors, the founder effect. And for sure, here we have an example that the ancestors, that the previous generations and its influence to the genesis of the contemporary generations, it's correlated on the small confidential phenomenon. Researchers are especially attracted to groups who have been socially or physically isolated or who rarely marry outside the group, and it provides the certain information which also come into the social confidential level, not just the private one. Because while we are using the information in the genetic research of this phenomenon of these groups, we are getting also to a certain social confidential level. The conclusion concerning the ethical issues, that first of all, most of the factors associated with the genetic information and genetic research have non-genetic analogs, and it's important, and it's supposed to be understood by the further research in bioethics. Secondly, that claims of genetic components carry complex societal implications. While we are coming to the role of the personhood, while we are coming to the role of the information after the death of the person, while we are talking about certain social disorders of the small social groups. And third conclusion, which is very important, loss of privacy is a major focus on policy and regulation, because the information is supposed to be precisely protected and the rules supposed to be acceptable by different social phenomena, by those who are using this information at the testing level, at the level of the social influence. That's the second part of the question concerning the genetic engineering, and next our meeting also will continue the discussion on the cloning procedure. Thank you and see you around.